Picture this. You're sitting in history class, expensive spices to cover up one of those facts that makes you go, wow, people back then were really something else. But here's the thing, it's completely wrong. This myth has been floating around for decades, repeated in classrooms, documentaries, and even some history books. It's become so ingrained in our understanding of medieval life that nobody stops to question it. Think about it. Would people really spend a fortune on spices just to make spoiled food edible? That's like buying a Rolex to tell time on a broken watch. Medieval people weren't just surviving. They were thriving with sophisticated food preservation techniques that would put some modern methods to shame. Preservation methods so effective that some of them are still used today in artisanal food production. In the next few minutes, we're going to tear this myth apart piece by piece. We'll explore how people actually preserved their food, why spices were really so valuable, and why this bizarre myth has stuck around for so long. By the end, you'll never look at medieval cuisine the same way again. Come from. Like many historical myths, it started with a grain of truth that got twisted way out of proportion. During the Victorian era, historians looking back at medieval recipe books noticed all these exotic spices being used. Instead of thinking, hey, maybe people just like tasty food, they jumped to some pretty wild conclusions. But these Victorian scholars had a real superiority complex about the past. They couldn't imagine that medieval people were sophisticated enough to appreciate complex flavors. Instead, they assumed our ancestors were basically cavemen in fancy clothes, willing to eat anything that wouldn't immediately kill them. This myth really took off in the early 20th century when it started appearing in textbooks. It fit perfectly into the narrative that everything before the modern era was primitive and dirty. Hollywood jumped on board, and suddenly every medieval feast scene in movies showed people gnawing on suspiciously spoiled-looking meat drowning in spices. The real kicker? These same historians who promoted this myth conveniently ignored the extensive medieval writings about food safety and preservation. They overlooked countless documents showing that medieval food inspectors would routinely check meat in markets and throw out anything that was spoiled. Butchers could face serious penalties, including hefty fines and public humiliation for trying to sell bad meat. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but some medieval cities had stricter food safety laws than we do today. Modern historians have thoroughly debunked this myth, but like a bad piece of meat, it refuses to go away. It's been repeated so many times that it's become common knowledge. Even though it's completely wrong, food preservation was primitive, you're in for a surprise. These people had preservation down to a science, and I mean that literally. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but medieval communities had entire systems of professional food preservers who passed down their techniques through generations. Let's start with meat, since that's what our myth is all about. The most common method was salting, but this wasn't just throwing some table salt on a steak. They had specific types of salt for different meats, and the process was incredibly precise. Cod preserved this way could last for years, which is exactly why it became one of the most important trade goods in medieval Europe. Smoking was another game changer. Medieval smokehouse operators were basically food preservation artists. They knew exactly which woods would give the best flavor and preservation properties. Oak for beef, applewood for pork, and beechwood for fish. Each combination was carefully chosen. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but many of these smoking techniques are still used by high-end meat producers today. Then there's the really clever stuff. Take confit, for example. By cooking meat slowly in its own fat and then storing it completely submerged, they created an airtight seal that would preserve meat for months. This wasn't just preservation, it was culinary innovation that made the food taste better. For fruits and vegetables, they had an entire toolkit of preservation methods. Drying was the obvious one, but they also had sophisticated methods of preserving fruits in honey or sugar. Medieval monasteries were particularly good at this. They developed some of the first recipes for what we'd now call jams and preserves. But perhaps the most impressive was their use of natural refrigeration. In northern regions, they cut ice from lakes in winter and stored it in specially designed ice houses. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were carefully engineered structures with drainage systems and insulation that could keep ice frozen well into summer. Some noble estates even had underground rooms designed to create air currents that would keep food cool. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but many medieval castles and monasteries had entire rooms dedicated to different preservation methods, each with its own specific temperature and humidity requirements. This wasn't random. It was based on centuries of observed knowledge about what worked best for different types of food. Let's get real about medieval meat consumption. And by real, I mean addressing the elephant in the room. Would people even survive eating rotten meat, spiced or not? The answer is a resounding no. Food poisoning doesn't care what century you're in, and medieval people knew this just as well as we do. Here's something that might blow your mind. Medieval people often had access to fresher meat than many of us do today. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but most medieval communities had strict rules about when and where animals could be slaughtered. In towns, butchers had to kill animals in designated areas where the meat could be inspected immediately. Think about the logistics for a second. Most medieval people lived in or near small communities where animals were raised locally. When they needed meat, they didn't go to a supermarket for plastic-wrapped products that had traveled hundreds of miles. Instead, they often knew exactly where their meat came from, sometimes from their own backyard or their neighbor's farm. The butchering process itself was fascinating. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but medieval butchers were masters of the nose-to-tail approach long before it became a trendy restaurant concept. Every part of the animal was used, and there was a careful system for distributing different cuts. The best parts went to the wealthy, sure, but even the poorest people could get access to organ meats and other nutritious cuts. When they did have leftover meat, medieval people didn't just let it sit around hoping some spices would make it edible later. They immediately processed it into sausages, pâtés, or dried products. These weren't just preservation methods, they were culinary techniques that created new and delicious foods. The ancestors of many beloved European sausages and cured meats were born from these practices. And here's the kicker. Medieval people were actually pretty picky about their meat. Market records show customers regularly inspecting meat for freshness and complaining about anything that didn't meet their standards. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but some medieval towns had food quality controls that would put modern health inspectors to talk about what spices really meant in medieval times and why the idea of wasting them on rotten meat is absolutely ridiculous. Imagine spending the equivalent of a year's salary on a Rolex, then using it as a paperweight. That's basically what our myth is suggesting medieval people did with spices. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but spices were so valuable that they were literally used as currency in some transactions. A pound of saffron could buy you a horse. A sack of pepper could be used to pay your rent for a year. People included spices in their wills alongside land and jewelry. These weren't just seasonings, they were serious wealth. The spice trade shaped world history. Venice built its entire empire on controlling spice routes. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but the exploration age wasn't just about finding new lands. It was largely driven by European powers desperate to break the Middle Eastern and Venetian monopoly on the spice trade. Columbus wasn't actually looking for America. He was trying to find a new route to the spice markets of Asia. Here's where the myth really falls apart. If spices were this valuable, who could actually afford to use them? The answer is pretty much only the wealthy elite. The average medieval person wasn't seasoning anything with imported black pepper or exotic cinnamon. They were using local herbs and seasonings from their gardens. Think garlic, onions, parsley and sage. And those wealthy people who could afford spices? They weren't using them to mask the taste of spoiled food. They were showing off their wealth by using these precious ingredients in elaborate dishes served at feasts and banquets. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but medieval recipe books from noble households show incredibly sophisticated spice combinations used to create complex layered flavors, much like modern high-end cuisine. The whole spicing rotten meat myth becomes even more absurd when you consider that medieval nobles were obsessed with fresh, high-quality ingredients. They had their own hunting grounds, private fish ponds, and carefully maintained gardens. These were people they were sophisticated recipes designed to show off wealth and create complex flavors, just like modern haute cuisine. The persistence of this myth says more about us than it does about medieval people. We love to think of the past as primitive and unsophisticated because it makes us feel superior. But the reality is that medieval people were just as clever as we are. They just had different technologies and priorities. So, what have we learned today? The idea that medieval people used spices to mask the taste of rotten meat isn't just wrong, it's a perfect example of how historical myths can blind us to the real ingenuity of our ancestors. These weren't primitive people stumbling through life, eating spoiled food because they didn't know any better. They were skilled craftsmen, talented preservers, and sophisticated traders who built an entire economy around food preservation and preparation. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but medieval food culture was incredibly complex and well organized. From the local butcher following strict guild regulations to the spice merchants financing international trade routes, every part of the food system was carefully managed to keep people healthy and well fed. Next time someone repeats this myth to you, ask them this: would you eat rotten meat if someone put pepper on it? Of course not, and neither would anyone else, in any century. Our medieval ancestors weren't just surviving, they were developing preservation techniques so effective that we still use them today. If you've enjoyed busting this myth with me, hit that subscribe button because we've got plenty more historical misconceptions to tackle. That subscribe button because we've got plenty more historical misconceptions to tackle. That subscribe button because we've got plenty more historical